excited to hear about your presentation. And I just want to say a few things before we get started. Sarah's been, in many ways, working on this project for almost 2 years. This has been a long-term project. This is a culmination of nearly 2 years of fellowships and scholarships that she's received to be working on this project. It started out with a summer research fellowship in 2017. She had a senior thesis project in the fall of 2017 in religious studies. Last summer she was in London on a London field studies project. Currently she's also finishing up a sociology senior thesis. So she has been working non-stop on this. And that's all basically in addition to just regular course taking, and she was a teaching assistant for me last semester as well. So she has been very committed to her research. It's a testament, right, really. This is a really great culmination of that. With us also is our committee. I've been the chair. My name is Brock Baylor. I teach in religious studies. Rachel Cranston does modern Jewish thought in religious studies as an associate professor. Dana Moss is here, assistant professor in sociology, and our outside reader is Dr. Catherine Lofton, who's coming from us from Yale, who teaches in religious studies, the Divinity School, American Studies, and history. So just one more word about kind of the schedule. Sarah's going to give us a 20 to 25 minute presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So please ask questions, anything that you need a question about. The Honors College directs presenters to kind of assume that people know what she's talking about, that she's basically speaking to the four of us. So if you have any, what in the world does this mean? Please ask a question, right? Anything. And then the way this works is that if you're not a committee member, you'll be dismissed after the Q&A time, and we'll ask questions to her privately. I don't anticipate that taking too much time, but they say usually up to about 30 minutes, and then the committee will dismiss you, and we'll have committee deliberation, and if you are all still staying after that, we'll invite you back in and wrap things up. Does that make sense, everyone? All right. You have the floor. Welcome, everyone, and let's give it one more minute.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you especially to my committee members for their wonderful feedback and time. I'm incredibly grateful for all of the support that I have from faculty members who are here and others who are not here. Now, to begin, ever the skeptic, Karl Marx dismissed the question of human origin as if we were dogs chasing our own tails. He said, "Who begot the first man and nature as a whole? Give up your question and you will also give up your abstraction." But the chase for meaning, for spirituality, is arguably a part of human life. So, unlike Marx, many have not given up the abstraction or the question of spirituality. Today, I address this question by creating a framework to understand the overlap between critical theory and spirituality, or a group I will call the foragers. In doing so, I will demonstrate the resonance between spirituality and early critical theory, particularly through the lens of 20th century Jewish feminists and today's queer Jewish feminists. These connections create a theoretical framework of 3 spiritual components: creative labor, community, and temporality. There's demographic precedent for creating a spiritual typology, especially recently. For example, you gotta love it. The non-religious, the nuns, and the spiritual but not religious make up about 1/3 of the US population, and this number is steadily growing. However, of that 1/3, about 1/5 believe that evolution was guided by a supreme being. So this can't simply be a matter of rising religiosity or scientific consensus. Something else is happening here. Today we'll describe one explanation of it: how a non-religious or spiritual identity could be a disavowal of hierarchical religious institutions rather than spirituality itself. I explain how people can take up critical perspectives influenced by critical theory, yet live a spiritual life. One version of this spirituality can be seen in queer Jewish feminists, my primary subject for today's talk. There are evident commonalities within this web of connections here, and today I will explain them. This framework is based on a mixed method approach, as you can see. We have ethnography that I've done in fieldwork in London and Pittsburgh, as well as philosophy, archival research, interviews, as well as primary and secondary literature. Beginning with my spiritual components today, I will demonstrate the salience of community, creative labor, and temporality using Marxist and queer feminist philosophy. Then I apply this framework using these other methodologies to early 20th century Jewish feminist writings and contemporary queer Jewish liturgy. Lastly, I'll end with a brief discussion. So you may be thinking, what is this word foraging and why are there parentheses in the middle? Well, foraging is a communally oriented framework that I've developed for critical spirituality. The term foraging with the parentheses is a wordplay on the dialectic between the terms foraging and forging. It hinges on the unification of opposing movements toward tradition and renewal. Confronting critiques about religion, foragers are disillusioned by those aspects that alienate their identities or their values, yet still enchanted by those that do not. So they forge their religious experience while forging others. In this way, the group neither solely renews nor returns to their spiritual lives, they forage from both. Overall, they are ambivalent of compulsory hierarchy and normativity, so foragers also draw upon a common positionality, the immanent frame, or horizontal transcendence. Here I'm referencing Charles Taylor's influential work, A Secular Age, in which he describes the immanent frame, or horizontal transcendence, within the secular. You can see that this positionality is interwoven into the three components that I'll get into in a minute. The positionality emphasizes fullness, ultimacy, wholeness, richness, and fulfillment. Since this language doesn't rely on hierarchical notions of transcendence, you'll notice that I make use of these terms often. Foragers, though, as a label, does not indicate any sort of school or institution or unified thought. Instead, the term is a format or a style of spirituality. Through the horizontal transcendence of three interrelated components, people may fulfill otherwise parts of themselves without sacrificing spirituality. These elements are integrated community, creative labor, and integrated temporality. Creative labor is the physical manifestation of personhood. Community denotes the primacy of interpersonal relations. And lastly, integrated temporality describes its materialist features. For each, I parallel Marx with 20th century contemporary foragers, and through criticality, foragers express these spiritual elements in a communally oriented way. So let's begin with creative labor. Creative labor is the special spiritual emphasis on creative aspects of human nature. Both Marxist philosophy and Jewish feminists inspired this component. Whereas Marx dubs creative capacity labor, queer Jewish feminists incorporate broader modes of creativity like writing, art, music, and poetry. Alicia, Ostriker, and queer Jewish liturgy adopt poetry as their recourse to being in the world. These sources emphasize the physical manifestation of human essence, highlighting its spiritually fulfilling functions. Beginning with critical theory's forebearer, Marx considers labor to be a central part of human life, of species being. Marx wrote, quote, "For it is not only the five senses, but the so-called spiritual senses, the practical senses, which can only come into being through the existence of its object, through humanized nature," unquote. The human capacity for richness may therefore be fully realized in labor. For example, when a carpenter carves a chair, the users, onlookers, buyers, everyone who witnesses this chair also witnesses the humanity of the carpenter in this chair. I don't know if these chairs were actually made by a carpenter or not, so I'm not going to use them as an example. You can imagine. Similar to Marx's philosophy, many feminists also place a spiritual emphasis on humanity's essential power to create. To Alicia Ostriker, this creative labor comes in the form of writing. She was raised as a third-generation atheist socialist Jew, in her own words. For her, being Jewish and critical of Jewishness are not mutually exclusive, as is tradition, as is common within the Jewish tradition as well. Ostriker expresses her spirituality through creative labor. In radical poetry, she remodels the Jewish tradition, and writing itself becomes a form of retrieval, of meditation and solidarity with Jewish spirituality. Ostriker read the Bible for the first time in college, on which she wrote, "From the first moment of contact, I experienced this book as mine. It's God as my God, atheist though I was and am. Do I contradict myself? Very well then. As an old leftist, as a feminist, as a poet, I attempt to wrestle a blessing from it. It resists, I persist." Ostriker is markedly aware of the alienation between spirituality and her identities, but instead of evacuating Jewish spirituality, Ostriker excavates it, forging and foraging spirituality. Despite, or perhaps because of this tension, Ostriker wonders, what do the stories mean to me and what do I mean to them? In her own words, she said, "I cannot tell until I write." Through writing, Ostriker constructs richness from creativity, or the manifestation of labor in the material world. This is echoed by contemporary queer Jewish liturgy, and as I mentioned in my own fieldwork, I came across two queer congregations, one in London and one in Pittsburgh, and these are their self-made sidurim. They published it themselves, and a lot of it was composed and put together by the congregations themselves. In the London version, there is, it's its own thing. There is an interesting prayer, an original writing from one of the congregants that really gets at this idea of creative labor. And actually, I would like to pass this around just because it's really cool to flip through. On page 10, it says, God may be found in whatever helps us broaden our perspective and restore us. Nature, art, music, poetry. These gifts of spirit bring us into the merchav, a healing spaciousness. In addition to the prayer books themselves, actually being composed of over half poetry, not just traditional liturgy, but actually their own writings, these books and this meditation directly points to nature, music, art, and poetry as being a source of transcendence, as a space or a mode of radical spiritual expression. Given this delimitation, it is clear that creative labor could be understood as self-transcendent, as a radical form of spirituality. Creative labor is thus a path for critical spiritual realization because it promotes a physical representation of the interconnectedness between space and self. Now, the next component is community. Community, as I mentioned, is the primacy of social relations on every scope. It exudes aspects of horizontal transcendence, and it's connected to Marx's idealized communist state, Jewish feminist universal mutuality, and queer Jewish solidarity. Again, beginning with Marx, human relations to him are transcendent. I should clarify that I'm not speaking about the really existing communist states that have occurred throughout history, but rather his philosophical treatment and vision of the communist state. He said, "For the human essence is no abstraction inherent in each individual, but rather an ensemble of social relations. Communism, to him, is the representation of holistic socialization. Communism is the realization of togetherness and altruism in that it reaffirms the well-being of all. In doing so, it removes the barrier of social alienation, allowing the full spiritual realization of humanity. Only in community," Marx states, "that with others, each individual has the means of cultivating one's gifts in all directions. Only in community, therefore, is personal freedom possible." And that was in his voice. Like Marx's communism, many Jewish feminists see the spiritual capacity of togetherness. Foragers recognize the transcendence embodied in integrating oppressed groups such as women, queer people, as well as Marx's primary concern, the working class. Vivian Gornick is one such Jewish feminist. Born into a communist Jewish family, Gornick traveled around the United States and interviewed former members of the Communist Party and the Old Left. She described the community among communists as one of the most amazing humanizing processes, that process whereby one emerges by merging. Men and women feel themselves through that which composes the shared, irreducible self. The socializing aspect of communism is a shared one. People, their creative labor, and their peers emerge by merging through community. Gornick shows the horizontal transcendence that links an individual to a community, a rich network of people. This alignment emphasizes the spiritual aspects within cultural and critical traditions. At the aforementioned queer congregations in London and Pittsburgh, there is a similar spiritual emphasis on community. In the London prayer book that's going around now, there's actually a prayer that I've tagged on page 58 called Contemplation for those who do not define their belief as a belief in God. Interestingly, this prayer actually points to something else as what their belief is in: community. It says, "We need times to set aside to come together as a community. At this moment, I am gathered here with others saying prayers apparently addressed to a transcendent God. Every day of my life, I employ traditions of speech which at the same time reflect and do not reflect the reality I understand before me. I believe in people, and I act as if we have hope for the future. Given our failure to build a world of peace and justice, such a belief may have even less foundation than a belief in God." Unquote. This meditation reframes the act of prayer as a linguistic attempt to reify community. I could go on and on about this passage. The whole prayer is so interesting. But I'll just say for today that it's a transcendent God here is offered as an option or even an unnecessary object of prayer. Instead, the content of prayers is less important. Prayer is a time and a space to cultivate richness through community. In this way, queer Jewish liturgy, Jewish feminists, and Marx encourage spiritual transcendence through the communal expression of common values and creativity. The last component is integrated temporality. In this component, which is inspired by Marx's dialectical materialism, it represents the wholeness of time and space, wherein the material world embodies more than what can be seen by the naked eye. In essence, it represents a transcendence of the physical world, but not in a binary way. The present and the future are imbued with their cultural and economic past. Marx, Jewish feminists, and queer Jewish liturgy understand that time and space play a transcendent role in a critical way. Again, beginning with Marx, his variety of materialism was retroactively called dialectical historical materialism by his co-author, Frederick Engels. According to M.J. Francesconi, quote, "The main principle of Marx's dialectical materialism is that everything consists of matter briskly in motion, and everything is constantly breaking down and dying, while constantly being renewed and reborn. The material world is thus dynamic and cumulative. Matter exists outside of the human mind, but continually moves along with human activity. Just as the material world changes humans through labor, humans change the material world through their creativity. Therefore, Marx's materialism shows a non-dualist way of integrating the past with the present and humanity with context. His call for unification is a call for temporal wholeness." Integrated temporality, like dialectical materialism, plays a large role in the foraging framework. Gornick and queer liturgy devise their spirituality to not only account for, but also rely upon materialism. They embed historicity into their spirituality so that people, matter, and time are integrated. In The Romance of American Communism, Gornick describes a community who often sat in her childhood kitchen. As a communist Jew herself, she perceives in them a reification of community, environment, and history. She writes, "When these people sat down at the kitchen table to talk, politics with a capital P sat down with them. Ideas with a capital I sat down with them. Above all, history with a capital H sat down with them. They spoke and thought within such a context that had world-making properties. This context lifted them out of the nameless, faceless obscurity. Within such a context, they could place themselves. They could become themselves." Here, Gornick points to history and context as a stimulus for becoming, for richness and integration in a purely material realm. This context had world-making properties because it was a fulfilling one. By placing themselves within this political, historical, and temporal outlook, Gornick forages spirituality from and with criticality. In the other queer prayer book that I mentioned from Pittsburgh, there is an interesting presentation of the need for congregation as a need for spiritual connection with time. And I'll pass this one around too. There are some interesting differences between the two congregations that I don't have time to get into today, but if you want to talk about that, I'd be happy to. It says on the first page that even more than to pray and to celebrate, we join together as a congregation to be a part of Klal Yisrael, the community of Israel, past, present, and future. And we join together as a Jewish congregation to care about one another and to share in our lives as or with gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender Jews, unquote. So beyond prayer and celebrations, this queer Siddur presents our congregation as a communal reassurance of queer and Jewish identities throughout time. Indeed, communal Shabbat services become a reclaimed time and space to safely rest in one's ancient communal home, in the feeling of belonging. This demonstrates the salience of all three foraging components: community, temporality, and creative labor. This liturgy is meant to affix Jews from all times into one sacred community that relies on yet supersedes temporality through criticality. This is the foraging framework. As a whole, critical spiritualists forage and forge their worldview through three interrelated components: creative labor, community, and integrated temporality. This trifold parallel between Marxist terminology and 20th century Jewish feminist revisions, as well as queer Jewish liturgy, demonstrates the salience between critical theory and spirituality. Marx, Ostriker, Gornick, and queer congregations forage Judaism for its life-giving parts and forge paths from what is left. So, foraging is not unified or even internally consistent. Still, there are commonalities. I hold that familial resemblances may be drawn from queer feminist Jews, Marx, and Jewish feminists. So foraging became a framework to analyze people and the ways in which they inhabit these two worlds that they may feel they cannot truly belong to: critical and spiritual. These three elements of foraging center on an understanding that people can critically forge spirituality into what a community needs and forage it from what it once had been. Due to its uniquely communally oriented, physical, creative, temporal, and spiritual elements, this phenomenon deserves a title. I should say that many people at this complicated web of identities don't necessarily identify with being spiritual or with being critical, or with the word foraging. That's obviously not something that somebody would describe themselves as. Whether someone considered themselves to be one of these was contentious, but this is the nature of naming, and we have to confront these tensions head on. The tension is almost palpable in the case of queer Jewish feminists, though it is not consistently the case. Jewish history has seen a great diversity of practice, opinion, and belief. Critique itself is valued within the tradition, so this tension is a particularly nuanced topic for critical Jews and deserves more attention than has been given here today for time purposes. The same could be said of queer people and women. Queer folks and women are as politically and spiritually diverse as any general population, so their critical and spiritual outlooks do not necessarily fit within the foraging framework. So the framework does not speak to communities simply on the basis of identity, or even Jewish identity, or queer identity, or being a woman or a feminist. It speaks to a particular worldview that sometimes revolves around certain identities. So my choice to study queer feminist Jews in particular was partially related to this compelling intersection of worldviews and identities, but it was also partially personal. As a queer Jewish person of the leftist and critical persuasion, my command of relevant issues and terminology enabled me to intimately engage with the dialogue. So the foraging framework was developed for those adjacent to me. On the whole, the continued discussion of spirituality vis-a-vis criticality is essential. More work on critical engagements with spirituality is necessary to understanding the various undertones of postmodernity. Complications regarding politics and population must be disentangled in order to discern how criticality affects spiritual expression. Therefore, a host of research is necessary to move forward in this project. Thus far, I've conducted this research in Pittsburgh and in London, and in the future I hope to consider cities like San Francisco, New York, Tel Aviv, Berlin, and more. My interest in queer Jewish feminist spirituality in the Anglo world is only the beginning. For now, the thrust of the matter rests in the forage at the end of Judaism. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Feel free. Sorry for a few of the questions, but any questions about the presentation?
Yeah. I know towards the end you told us that you were Jewish feminist queer. Was there any other main reasonings for why you wanted to pick this topic in particular, other than you identifying very close related? What was the influence or?
So I'd say that it was primarily influenced by the knowledge that I had already. I didn't have to feel that I did extra legwork to be admitted into a community that I was an outsider of, and these are such intimate topics, talking about people, about their politics or about their relationship with God is very personal. So I felt that as a Jewish queer person, I felt more able to access that information and actually felt that it was important in my role and a responsibility that I had to do that as well and to use that access for this project. I actually had also looked into Metsitsa, or indigenous Chicana spiritualities, as well as a little bit in liberation theology within South America and Nicaragua in particular. I believe that it was better to focus specifically on one that I was the most familiar with. Yeah.
So can I actually, also sort of in the way you shaped this and thought about this project, and this is totally, I guess, fell as a former director of a Jewish studies program and chair of a real studies program, to have someone who work with kind of really intense engagement with philosophical and theological texts. And I feel like even, in some ways, I think it's rare to find full, distinguished professors doing really serious.
And archival work.
Yeah.
Right, and archival work. That's right. There's archival too. Right. Really, and there's even a history of the book component as you pass around the Cedar, which of course warms my heart.
I wanted to talk to you about
in
this.
ways also, right? So, but I mean, to combine that many things and to do it with such seriousness and sophistication. So I'm sort of in awe to begin with, but then I guess something I have to turn it into a question. Can you talk a little bit just about, maybe a reflection on, besides how wonderful the opportunities we gave you here, but to, just to reflect a bit on how you were able to pull together these ways of studying and producing knowledge that are usually kept pretty separate in the academy, and so that would really be, I just would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a really important question and something that's been on my mind a lot. I think one of my frustrations, it's funny, is that I don't see it as being distinct. I don't see these methodologies as having this place that should be kept and separate. I think that all of them and any of them should be combined in order to disentangle how the history, how the real life, how the societal structures, how the inner workings of the mind all fit together, because they're not separate in real life. And I've often found it actually more frustrating that that's the way that academia operates. So in a way, actually, I think my frustration hasn't come from combining them, it's actually from trying to separate them out. In each department, in each person that I've been working with, I see different expertise, I see different ways of approaching the topic, all of which I love, and all of which I'm trying to absorb. But at the same time, I can't do all of them at all times. So that has been difficult. It's been difficult to, I think, fulfill all of them genuinely and do a good job at all of them without sacrificing my commitment to interdisciplinary studies. Mm-hmm.
On that note, I'd like to echo how impressive this is, and I just think what you produced is so above and beyond, and it's just been a joy to see it develop and to watch you go out in the world and learn all of this stuff, because I think you're asking questions that fascinate all of us, like how can you be spiritual and atheist and at the same time, and how does that work, and how does politics get involved? It's fabulous. As a field researcher, ethnographer, sociologist myself, I was wondering if you could illuminate a little bit more about the time spent in the field, how you established rapport, and what it was like. Could you give us a sense of maybe the similarities or differences in being in that space in London versus Pittsburgh? I'd just love to know more about those.
Sure. Thank you so much for your question, and thank you for your accommodations. The question about fieldwork is difficult because there are such different contexts, and oftentimes I want to be able to talk about them at once, but I can't. So I'll just start out with London, because chronologically that's where I formally started my field work. It was difficult, to say the least, to get into contact with people in the initial stages, but after I made those connections, actually in London, people were so excited about this research. People were overjoyed that it was happening, and they often introduced me excitedly, like, oh my gosh, this person's doing research on this. So I actually didn't find any difficulty building that rapport. I don't know what it would have been like if I had introduced myself differently. Actually, there was this one time that I mispronounced a word, I just stumbled over my words because I was nervous, and a rabbi was like, are you Jewish? And I was like, oh yeah, I'm sorry, I just stumbled over my words. That was the only time that there was a hiccup. Most of the time, I found that my Jewish identity and being queer, almost immediately, I sort of think there's a connection there. I didn't ask them, up front, is it because I'm Jewish that you're talking to me about this? It didn't happen like that. But in Pittsburgh, I found a little bit more difficulty talking to people, specifically about politics. People are often really scared, I think, to say things outright. They'll sort of skirt around issues. That was the case in London, certainly for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but not as much, not nearly as much as here in Pittsburgh. The other thing that was interesting is that in London, queerness was not really brought up at all. People would talk freely about, one of their rabbi friends having won a chair for the Labour Party, and joking about, well, can you guess which one it is? What party it was? Well, of course it was the Labour Party. That was just the joke. And whereas in Pittsburgh, like I said, they're actually apolitical, this congregation. That's what they've described to me. And as for queerness, though, Pittsburgh is actually a lot more open and upfront about that. They talk about it often in their prayer book, and they talk about it often at all of their gatherings. So I found it much easier to talk about queer issues in Pittsburgh than in London. Overall, though, both places have been incredibly welcoming, and it's been a really interesting experience as a researcher to go into those spaces and be familiar with them, but come at it from a different angle.
Have you been keeping tabs on your own personal growth in the way that you are approaching topics to Judaism? From the beginning of your research, what sort of topics would you talk about versus now what sort of language are you using to describe your own relationship to Judaism?
To be honest, I think I've been able to separate it fairly well. I don't think that, and maybe I'm lying to myself about this, I don't know. I think that it's been important to be able to critically reflect on my own relationship to Judaism and my own issues with the overlap between queerness and feminism. But it's also been incredibly eye-opening, I think, throughout this experience to see that I'm not the only one who has these questions. I'm not the only one who has these problems. and look at all these people that are figuring it out. They're making it work. And I think for me, I've noticed that I have felt more comfortable inhabiting that weird vagueness, that gray space that often comes with being an outsider within an outsider space, being a queer person within a minority of Judaism. So that's something that I've just become more aware of. And I think over time, maybe in 20 years I'll think about this differently, but I, at this point, still believe that it was mainly developed and mainly reflecting not on myself, but on those around me and those people that I see working out these issues themselves.
So first of all, I also wanted to add to the praise and just mention how exciting and gratifying it has been to encounter a student who is so both passionate and thoughtful and serious about this material. It's really wonderful. So I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about this transnational aspect of your work, not only in terms of fieldwork challenges, but you said that where you want to go with this eventually is to make it even more transnational, like really think about this kind of global, queer, feminist, Jewish foraging. And I was just curious about the balance that you feel like that transnational aspect would bring to this work, and how it affects the ideas that you're thinking about.
That's a really good question. I think the reason why I initially looked into London and in Pittsburgh had been to see what the McCarthy era had to do with the political inflections of Jewish queer groups, and to really try to isolate that. But it actually became much more, I think, of a natural transition into thinking about the ways that Judaism, queerness, and womanhood are universal. They're diasporic in the case of Jews. Queerness isn't, limited to a country, so why should this research be? Same thing with being a woman. I think that it will be difficult to make the argument that they deserve to be compared on similar planes because, of course, their context is so particular, and that's something that I really struggled with in looking at Pittsburgh and London. But as I look to expand, I hope that it will become clearer how these connections are actually necessary to make, because we're entering in and are in a world where we're increasingly interconnected. People have translation skills through Google, through whatever, and we're not so isolated anymore. I think it's necessary to look at this transnationally.
I mean, one thing I was noticing even looking through the London Siddur was that so many of the writings were from American kind of countercultural renewal rabbis.
Yeah.
So even the material itself seems to have this global reach.
Yes.
In a way that's or if not global, at least Anglo reach.
Yes.
And I was curious about how that might be as well.
Yeah. There are a number of them that are translated from Yiddish as well, so it's not just within the Anglo world, they just happen to translate it. And I think that is also opening up more questions specifically about Germany to me, and Minsk even. How is it that that history of Jewish secularism influenced and made its way and trickled its way into this liturgy? And it's going to be difficult, I think, to pin it down, but I have an inkling that it's there.
And it also seems like it's such a promising angle to take because the threats to Jewishness, to being queer, to womanness and feminism are global right now. And so seeing how different communities are reacting and grappling will be a fascinating axis of comparison.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I was you study these small communities and you describe it as being an outsider within an outsider.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if you thought that these different streams of thought and energy was going to, or is currently affecting mainstream Judaism and changing it as well.
I definitely think that feminist contributions to Judaism, even though they were at the fringe at some points, have made their way into pretty much all modernized, well, not all modernized, but a good portion of it has been updated to include women and the matriarchs into liturgy. I think that there's a broader idea and consciousness within the Jewish movement, Jewish circles, that women have a place in Judaism, that women's history has a place in Judaism. Queerness, I think, is still growing. I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. But even that, comparatively speaking, has really, really exploded based on some of these really critical figures, such as Judith Plasko. I didn't really talk about her today, but she's one of the major figures that has definitely, I think, influenced this work. Yes.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This is an inspiration, especially as you think about questions of descriptive and normative and the relationship between the two. I want to press further to the answers you've given to two questions from your colleagues, suggesting that it's your particular location is a convenience for knowledge. I find often male scholars assume their particular location is just a secular that everyone should join, and female scholars are like, oh, well, it's just an advantage I had, that's why I chose it, it's not an argument. I'd like to press you to make an argument from the place where you began, because in my own work on queer theory and religion, it's not surprising that you can find queer congregationalism in Judaism and not other forms of historic tradition. We don't have to get into a long comparative religions project, but what would you say to making the claim, it does matter that it's Judaism, that there would be harder to find such resources for congregational life and thinking in Catholicism or evangelicalism or in Buddhism. They exist, there are queer lives to be observed and talked about, but the congregationalism I think is interesting in the tradition. So is there any way to press that into an argument, or is there a reason that you're wary to do that, to say Judaism matters here in a stronger way?
I think the first things that come to mind that I actually considered, neglected to mention, that it was a priority of mine to center this project on the other, to understand that so many spiritual typologies are based on Christianity, and particularly Protestantism and Catholicism. And frankly, I was tired of it. It didn't seem that Judaism and Jewish secularism, that's the other thing, secularism often centers on what does it mean for like an ex-Christian or a Christian-ish person to be secular. That doesn't neatly apply to Jewish secular people, and that was a question in my mind. And I think that really gets at this history of Jewish secularism, if you want to call it that, having room for ambiguity, having room for criticality in its history. I think the ways that we have chavrot, or like circles of women throughout time that have gathered to learn together, this is something that isn't institutionalized in the same way that Christianity and other religions often tend to be. And so that leaves, I think, presses the question more and has more space within the tradition to explore these ambivalences. I think there's, instead of necessarily or having to just say, I'm queer, I don't fit in anymore, there's other ties that draw people back beyond just God or the safety of heaven or something like that. It's much more, it's communal, it's temporal, and I think it's creative. There's a connection that people have that isn't necessarily tied to the religion in the same way that we tend to think of religion today. And that's why I chose Judaism, not just because it was convenient, but because it was important to center on the other and to understand how Judaism as a religion in a very difficult, tricky category of religions can be explained in other ways.
presentation was fantastic. I mean, some of the questions we had earlier this week about presenting it, I think you've really done a great job of offering a clear and compelling presentation of how all of your pieces work together, and I know that was one of your concerns, and so this has been really, really fantastic. One of the observations that I was making in my head as you were talking today was, right, so Marx, deeply influenced by Hegel, and there's this like very positive teleology in his philosophy of history, right? For him, history is going somewhere, and he's pretty confident he knows where it's going. And that seemed to be expressed particularly by Gornick's quote as well, with the politics with a capital P and ideas with a capital I, and right, this sense of like there's like substantial understanding of participating in this kind of continuous history, and yet it seems there's this ambivalence between that and, as the term foraging implies, right, this like, what do we do with this disintegrated history, right, where this sense of like, we don't know where we're going. I was thinking of the prayer that you read from, like, I believe and I act as if we have a hope for the future, and yet given our failure to build a world of peace and justice, right, so there's this seeming like, this disjointedness, or I don't know if nostalgia is the right word for it, but like this desire to see ourselves in this like integrated history, and then also recognizing on the ground this sense that history is disintegrated and we're picking up the pieces. How do you see them kind of negotiating those two, right? Articulating that relationship, whether that's in the text themselves or with the people that you talk to.
Mm-hmm. I think that Marx definitely had this very strong vision of the world to come here, that we were headed certainly for revolution, for the whole world to be communist. Every single letter he got between him and Engels, they would often just joke about, well, you know, the Irish are uprising, it's time, it's happening. But of course that never did happen, and I think that's, especially post-Holocaust, within the Jewish communities, there's a sense of despondency, of hopelessness that is difficult to stave off, even with spirituality. And I'm not sure that they are worked out. I don't think they are negotiated. I think these are tragedies and tragedies of history that we're still very much confronting, that historians are confronting as well as the people that we're studying. So I'm not sure that there is any negotiation to be found. I don't think that they're looking in the same way either. I think it's just sort of a reality that has been accepted, and in a way I think that prayer really points to that, the one that you brought up as a contemplation for those who cannot define their belief as a belief in God. It's a mouthful. But essentially, the fact that they're saying, I act as if we have a hope for the future, is saying, you know, I don't know if we do, but I guess we have to try. Yeah. And that's pretty much most of the responses I found in my interviews have been, people are sad, people are, especially now in this political moment in time, but I think overall they have these ties to the people they love and to their ancestry that they feel is worth holding on to, and that helps them try.
Building off of that comment and question in response to it, again, my experience of religious studies is very minimal and mostly through you, but it seems that a lot of religious communities have some sort of at least spiritual conception of what the future holds for them, either in terms of them personally or the religion as a whole. A lot of the different conceptions of the afterlife, or in certain circles of Judaism, conceptions of rebuilding the temple. And it's this idea that there's a future, and it fits into narratives of negotiating with your past to construct a story that builds on religious tropes and contexts to, construct a narrative that we went from here and now we're going towards there. What's the conception of the future in these communities? How do they conceive of where they're going spiritually and where they're going to end up tomorrow?
I think that's a really good question, and something I haven't considered. I think that the communities in particular that I've studied, they're older people. I think I'm not sure they're concerned too much with their future beyond that of their lives, just because of where they are in life. Oftentimes I find that people are interestingly in Pittsburgh, they responded, in my interviews, responded to others' critiques that they were homonormative or that they were overly binary by saying, well, that's okay, this is who we are. And I get the sense that that's very much in line with the holding on to this thing that they've created and finding comfort in that and finding consistency in that. So I don't really know how much of it is focused on the future at this point. I think it's mostly trying to get through the moment.
All right, we're gonna go to our next portion of the film process, and two of you can dismiss yourselves. I don't know if we have, we can talk and see what